Hello, are you about to drain your central heating system down, but you can't find your drain valve? Or maybe you found your drain valve and you don't want to use it for some reason. Maybe you watched my other video before this one, which highlights all the problems that you can get with a drain valve. But don't worry, I've got you covered. I'm going to show you several different ways which I use to drain the system down or drop the pressure without using a drain valve. You can then carry out your work like changing a leaking radiator valve or maybe a radiator without the need to use a drain valve. If you want to watch my video all about the problems you can get with drain valves, obviously you can click on the link above now or find it down in the description, where you'll find lots of other helpful links all about your central heating system, like how to change that leaking radiator valve or radiator without even draining your system. So it's worth checking those out. And of course I give you tips right to the end of the video, so do try and stick around. Right, now let's get on with draining the system without a drain valve. So you want to drain your central heating system down. Maybe because you want to change a radiator, or perhaps you've got a leaking radiator valve that needs replacing. For whatever reason, we're going to drain the system down. Of course, you can use a drain valve, but like I said before, very often I won't use the drain valve because of the problems that can occur. And what do you do if you can't even find the drain valve? Right, so let's forget this drain valve and drain the system down using the same radiator. So this is method number one. Now, if you have a thermostatic radiator valve, you want to just make sure that it is working properly. So remove the head and make sure that the pin pushes up and down nice and smoothly. And the pin needs to be pushed all the way down to close the thermostat. If you've got a decorator's cap, even better, because that'll make sure that the radiator valve is definitely closed. If you don't have a thermostat, you've got a wheel head valve, make sure that is fully closed. So now I'm going to close this thermostatic valve down to its off position. So that valve is now closed and turned off. I'm then going to go to the other end of the radiator and close that valve also. So both valves need to be fully shut. Now this is a lock shield valve, and to close this valve I need to take the screw out of the top, then remove the cap, then I'll use a small adjustable spanner to close the valve. Now when you close this valve you want to count how many turns it takes to close it. So 1, 2, 3, and that's only just a quarter of a turn. So I'll make a note of that so that when I come to reopen it, I'll open it the same number of turns. That will ensure that if the system has been balanced, it's going to stay balanced correctly. And of course, if you want to know about balancing your system and how to make it more efficient, I've made a separate video on that, and I'll leave it linked in the cards above now. Now, as usual, I'm going to use my water vacuum, because it makes my life so much easier and it's going to be better to demonstrate to you exactly what I'm doing. So if you haven't got a water vacuum, or even if you do, make sure that you put plenty of towels down, have some bowls, be ready to catch water, because that's what we're going to be doing. And very often I'll fold the carpet back if there is one, or ideally choose a radiator where you have a hard floor, maybe tiles or lino. Somewhere you can mop up spills really easily. So turn on the water vacuum. So now you'll need a couple of adjustable spanners, and we're going to be undoing the nut that connects the radiator valve onto the radiator. Now it's really tempting just to turn that nut on its own, which connects the valve to the radiator, but don't do that. Always support the radiator valve. So use another pair of adjustable spanners to hold the valve and stop the valve from twisting, because if the valve twists, then it may damage the joint which connects the valve onto the pipework, and then you'll have to fix that joint as well. So now I've loosened the nut which holds the valve onto the radiator. Now I can carefully pull it off. You've got to be careful here because we might get a sudden gush of water, and if one of those valves hasn't closed properly, then we might get water actually pouring out. So we've got to be careful. Now depending on your pipework, that's going to determine whether you'll be able to pull the valve away from the radiator. And you can see I've got plenty of movement. Now if your pipework comes up through a solid floor or through the wall, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to use this method. So maybe look for another radiator, but don't worry, I'll show you another method in just a moment. Now all the time we've got the radiator valve off the radiator is going to keep dripping water out of it like it is here. So what I'm going to do is just put a bit of kitchen roll and just push it up inside the hole. I could use a cap if I wanted to, but that's going to do for now. Don't use toilet paper because it breaks up and will get stuck inside the radiator. Now we've removed the radiator valve, all we need to do now is open the radiator valve, whether it's a thermostat or a wheel head or even a lock shield. Then the water's going to start coming out. And you can see there I've got my water vacuum and I'm catching the water that's coming out of the radiator. If you're a little concerned about putting your radiator valve back together after you finish your draining, don't worry, again I've got you covered. I made a video all about how to use compression fittings. So here's another radiator and the valve doesn't really move around a lot. The pipe's quite stiff so I can't move that valve about. Now I've got a 15mm compression cap and I'm just going to pop that onto the radiator to stop it from continuously dripping whilst I drain the system from the valve. Now like I said, this pipework doesn't give me much movement. I can just about get my vacuum in there, but really I want to connect a hose pipe onto this valve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my adjustable spanners, hold the valve and just loosen the nut that holds the valve onto the pipework. Now obviously be careful when you do this. There's a very remote possibility the valve might actually burst off, but I just want to loosen the nut enough so I can actually just rotate the valve around, so I can then connect a hose pipe onto the valve. And of course, as soon as you loosen the nut, you may get water coming out of that connection. So make sure you got towels down to catch that water. Now I've loosened it enough so I can rotate the valve around and quickly nip that nut back up again, because now I've got water running down the pipe which is coming out of that joint. Now I could just use my water vacuum and drain the system that way, but we want to attach a hose pipe, so let's do that. Now here I have my hose pipe with a little bit of copper pipe put in the end of it, and I've got a Jubilee clip holding the hose onto the copper pipe. Now I'm going to add a nut for a 15mm compression fitting, pop on a 15mm olive as well. And now the 15mm pipe will fit exactly into the radiator valve, and we're just going to nip that nut up onto the valve. Now all I need to do is to open the valve and I can drain the entire system using this method. So what do you do if you've got this style of radiator valve where you have the large union nut holding the valve onto the radiator? Well, I do it exactly the same as before, but instead I use a washing machine hose. And you can see here I've got the 90-degree elbow with a rubber washer that screws straight onto the valve, and then you can just open the valve up and drain the system that way. Obviously you'll need to connect another bit of hose pipe onto your washing machine hose, but that's pretty straightforward. Here's another radiator valve where I'm doing exactly the same thing, but I haven't rotated the valve around, so I can get that 90-degree elbow just onto the valve and then I can open it up and drain the system. Another option you can use once you remove your radiator valve is to drain it from the radiator itself. So I've got my water vacuum on the radiator tail, and now I'm just going to open up the valve at the other end of the radiator, and that's going to let the water flow through the radiator and drain the system that way. Little bonus tip for you, this is a really good way to flush out the bottom of the radiator and remove all that dirty magnetite that might be sitting at the bottom of your radiator. And giving the radiator a tap with a rubber mallet at the same time will help remove that magnetite. And remember, magnetite is the enemy of your system and boiler. It sticks to everything and gradually kills it. Now we can connect the hose pipe directly onto the radiator tail. The tail is 15mm, same size as copper tube. It can be a little tricky, so you might need to remove the olive and the nut. To do this, I use an adjustable spanner. I adjust it down so it fits onto the tail, and then you can leave it against the back of the tail so you don't scratch your paintwork. If it's been a little stubborn, you can just tap your spanner and that will also push the nut and the olive off the tail. Hopefully you can then push your hose pipe onto the tail, then get a Jubilee clip, push that on and do it up nice and tight, and then once again open up the valve at the other end of the radiator, and you can then drain the system down. If you have a valve with the large union nut and you want to drain it from the radiator, we can still use the washing machine hose, but we'll need to add a straight connector. Now, if you haven't got a drain valve, it's a good idea to replace one of your valves with a radiator valve that has a drain on it. And this is the easiest way to add a drain valve onto your heating system. Now I'm going to show you what I think is probably one of the easiest methods to partly drain the system. So I might use this method if I just wanted to drain upstairs or drop the pressure, but I don't want to go messing around with drain valves or taking radiator valves apart. Now you can't use this method if you've got a roll top radiator and you only have a bleed valve in the radiator and you don't have that large blanking plug. So we need a radiator with this 1/2 inch bleed valve or blanking plug. So we need to do exactly the same as before. We need to close both of the radiator valves and make sure that they are fully shut. So that's the thermostat closed. And then I'm going to go to the lock shield and close that valve also. So that one is now fully closed. Now I'm going to go to the blanking plug at the top of the radiator and remove it. Now I wanted to show you this radiator here because it's got a lot of water actually above the blanking plug. So as soon as I remove it, all that water is going to come pouring out of the radiator. So if you've got this style of radiator, make sure that you're ready to catch that water because it may be filthy black. Now this bleed valve plug has been a bit of a pain and it's going to stay tight in the radiator and it's just suddenly going to drop out. Now with this style of radiator you're not going to get too much water coming out, but there will be some water that comes out and you do need to be ready to catch it. And if one of your radiator valves isn't closed fully, you're going to get water continuously pouring out of the blanking plug hole. So before you remove the blanking plug, you want to open up the bleed valve and just let the pressure out of the radiator. Then you won't get a sudden gush of water when you remove the blanking plug or radiator valve. This will also tell you if one of your radiator valves isn't closed fully because the water won't stop coming out. Now it doesn't matter too much if one of your radiator valves is letting water pass, but just be aware when you move that blanking plug, water's going to be continuously coming out. So you'll need to move quickly on to the next stage. Here we go, the blanking plug just falls out. Now I've got towels and bowls down to catch that water, but of course I've got my water vacuum, so I'm going to use that so I can quickly suck up that water and drain that top part of the radiator of the water. And you can see we've got this large column along the top of the radiator which is all full of water which needs to drain out. I'm going to really quickly jump in here and introduce myself. My name is Mark Ballard and I've been a gas registered engineer for over 30 years. The aim of my channel is to help you with your gas boilers and your central heating. If you find this video at all useful, then please give me a little bit of feedback by clicking on the old thumbs up and subscribe. That will help others to find the video and of course share it with anyone else who may be interested. If you visit my website, I've categorized all my videos on products and parts that I recommend so you can easily find what you're looking for. And I'd like to say a really big thank you to everybody who's bought me a cup of coffee and left me a donation in my Toolbox fund. It's really appreciated and it does really help me to make more videos which will hopefully help you. Now I could use my water vacuum and stick it on the end here and just open up the radiator valve, and that's going to let the pressure out of the rest of the system. And I could even drain the system doing this, but of course I would need to empty my vacuum several times, but I have done it this way and it does work. So there we go, that radiator valve is now fully open and all the pressure has now been removed from the system. Now of course if you've got an open vented system with a loft tank, then of course water's just going to keep on pouring out. I'll cover loft tanks in a couple of minutes. But this is a combination boiler and because the other radiator valve is still closed, it creates an airlock. This is also a really easy way to add chemicals into your system, like inhibitor to stop corrosion. But we want to drain the system and use a hose pipe. Here I have a radiator valve tail, but the best idea is to buy yourself a little adapter, which you can get from Screwfix for just a couple of pounds. Wrap a little bit of PTFE tape around the thread and just screw it into your radiator. And that's going to stop any leaks whilst you drain the whole system down. Nip it up with a spanner and there we go, we're ready to attach our hose pipe. So attach the hose pipe and always use a Jubilee clip because you don't want that hose pipe bursting off and suddenly having water pouring all over your floor. Now you can open one or both of your radiator valves, and this is the fastest way to drain the system. much quicker than a drain valve, because you've got both radiator valves open and a full bore hose pipe to a drain outside. Now obviously don't forget that anything below the hose pipe will still be full of water. So this is a really good method for removing pressure or draining all the radiators upstairs by connecting it onto a radiator downstairs, and then later you can drain those downstairs radiators a lot more easily. Now before we actually start draining the system, we want to switch the power off to our boiler and system. For all systems, it's better to turn the power off from the main switch just to make sure that there's no additional pumps that could start running, which would get damaged. If you have a traditional system, we're going to need to stop the loft tank from continuously refilling the system. And I'll show you how to go about doing that after I've shown you how to fully drain your system down. So if you have a combination boiler or a sealed system boiler, then we don't need to worry about loft tanks. We can start opening bleed valves and draining the system down. Just watch out when you open them because you might get a bit of water come out. So you want to start from the top of the house and open up the highest and the tallest radiators first of all, like a towel rail, and then gradually work your way around and down through the house, opening up the bleed valves. And then you should hear air being sucked into the radiator as the radiator drains of water. Now some radiators hardly let any air in at all, so I'll sometimes remove the bleed plug altogether, and that speeds the whole process up. But be careful you don't drop it and lose it, because you may not be able to get a replacement. And like I said before, you just work your way around the system, opening up the bleed valves and letting the air get sucked in and the water drain out. If you've got radiators like this where the pipework comes down the wall, you'll have to drain each of these radiators individually. But if you just want to work on one of those radiators, then you don't need to drain all the others. If you have zone valves or mid-position valves on your heating system, then you can manually open these up because they may be creating an airlock and keeping water in the system. Now this is a mid-position valve and most valves have a lever on so you can manually open them up. So I push the lever across like that, push it into the little slot, and that will hold the valve half open, allowing water to flow past it. To close it again, we unclip it and then the spring inside should pull the valve back to its resting position. If you have automatic air vents or even manual air vents in your airing cupboard or anywhere else in your system, you may want to open those up as well. So here I'm just going to unscrew the cap and remove it, and then that will let the air go into the system. That's providing it's actually working and not blocked up. Once you've finished draining your system, it's a really good idea to go back around the system and do up all the bleed valves and put any back in again which you may have taken out. And before you refill your system, double check that you've definitely closed all of the bleed valves. Otherwise you may suddenly find water pouring through your ceiling. And trust me, this does happen. Right, now let's move on to that loft tank. Now if you have a traditional system which has loft tanks, we need to stop it from continuously refilling the system after we've actually started draining our system. Now this is a F&E tank, which stands for feed and expansion, and this supplies the central heating system. Now I've got this demonstration tank for you and I've got to bung it in the outlet, so I'm going to remove the bung. That's the equivalent of starting to drain the system, and in just a moment we'll see the float valve will drop and then it'll start refilling the tank. Now you may have a stopcock in your airing cupboard, or sometimes there's a service valve on the actual valve which you could turn the water off to stop it from refilling, but I very often won't use these because when you close them they then might start leaking, and then that's something else you have to fix. So instead of using the valves which might potentially start leaking, we can just get a piece of wood. I've got a piece of solder here, so a piece of wire, or maybe use string, and then I put the wood across the tank. I use my solder, tie it around the piece of wood, and that's going to keep the float valve closed and stop the tank from refilling. And there we go, that's nice and secure. Now you do want to make sure it is secure because you don't want to be working on the system and then all of a sudden that float valve slips and it starts refilling the system. That would be a bit of a nightmare. Now here's a feed and expansion tank up in a loft, and it's full of weird kind of a gooey stuff which we do not want to get inside our central heating system. You can also see I've got the float valve held up with a piece of plastic tube where I've cut a V in it. So before you start draining the system, it's a really good idea to go up to your loft tank and check how dirty it is and clean it out, because we don't want any of that stuff running down through our central heating system and potentially causing more problems. So give it a good old clean. Once you finish your work, you can release the float valve and it will start refilling our system. Now I regularly use rubber bungs to bung up the loft tank to stop the tank from refilling the system, and I also use them to create an airlock where I can then carry out work without actually draining the system at all, which obviously saves hours of time. If you'd like to know a little more about the correct procedure for using these bungs, then I've left the link in the cards above now. Right, that's about it then. So I hope this video's helped you if you want to drain your central heating system down. Let me know in the comments how you get on. Maybe you've got a better way of draining the system down. If you want to watch my video on all the problems you get with drain valves, then you can click on a link just there. If you want to know how to change a radiator valve without draining system, then click on that link just there. And as usual, click on the old thumbs up, click on subscribe, share it with anyone who may be interested, and a cup of coffee in my toolbox fund is always really appreciated. Bye for now, and I hope to see you in the next video.